All right, people are pouring in. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Letterform Lectures Online Edition. My name is Grendel. I'm Education Director at Letterform Archive, which is also the home of Type West, our School of Type Design. We have an international audience today, so please type in where you're coming from in the chat. If you have questions for the speaker, please drop those in the Q&A, and we will upvote the ones that you'd like to see answered. I want to give, first of all, a huge shout out to Skilla Zaccolini. Skilla is doing the behind the scenes heavy lifting to make this lecture series happen. So thank you again, Skilla. Once again, please type in where you're coming from in the chat. And also maybe let us know what brought you here. How did you find out about this lecture and why are you interested in it? Okay. Moving on, welcome to Letterform Lectures 2024. We host these informative talks 12 times a year to round out our Type West students' education. And speaking of Type West, our type design grads of 2023 have a website, and their original typefaces are now available for viewing. So Skilla is going to drop a link to that website in the chat. Please take a moment to check them out. They are amazing. And if you can't get enough of their fonts, you can watch their amazing graduation videos, which Skilla is also going to drop in the chat. Okay, coming up on our workshop front, we have a Latin Arabic logo matchmaking workshop. And this will teach you the basics of Arabic calligraphy styles, and also show you ways to pair Arabic and Latin letter forms in ways that make sense. So you'll focus on bilingual logo designs that work. All levels are welcome. No prior knowledge of Arabic is necessary for this workshop. Okay, next up, putting pencil to pixel. Our popular instructor, Angie Che, returns to teach you how to do gorgeous hand lettering on the iPad. Bring words to life in this fantastic and fun hands-on workshop starting in May. Okay, we are also, heads up, going to be offering another 10-week Intro to Modern Type Design workshop, both online and in person this summer, and a Spanish language version one as well. So keep your eyes peeled for that. You can learn more and find out how to register at letarc.org/events. And better yet, become a member of Letterform Archive today, and that will help keep great lectures like this one going. Finally, be sure to follow us on Instagram to stay on top of upcoming events, programs, workshops, etc. Okay. Letterform Lectures are co-presented by the Letterform Archive and the SFPL Book Arts and Special Collections. Letterform Archive is a nonprofit institution housing over 100,000 works of graphic design history. We are dedicated to the art and the craft of the letterform. And you can view all letterform lectures soon after they happen online. Just check our website, letterformarchive.org. Okay, Leah Spencer is a graphic designer for film and TV. And she created the typography for Amazon series set in the 1950s, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And she's going to give us a look at the behind the scenes work necessary to create an authentic look for period film and TV. Okay, she told us a funny story. On her first film and TV job, she was asked to make a delivery to set in Central Park and was told to ignore the signs for no cars and just drive right in. Ha ha ha. First of all, she'd never driven in Manhattan before. Then when she gets to Central Park, she got lost and she wound up on a one-way 3-mile loop on which she was chased by a large pack of angry bicyclists who, as a cyclist myself, I'm going to say were entirely justified, were screaming at her to GTFO of Central Park with her death machine. Okay, she eventually found a park employee who got her to the set, but barely. New York cyclists do not put up with bad driving. Okay, without further ado, let's welcome Leah Spencer.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to share my work with you. So I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, oops, sorry. Okay, so yeah, thank you for having me. I'm a huge fan of Letterform Archive, so I'm really honored to be speaking today. So as Grendel mentioned, I am a graphic designer for film and TV. And a few years ago, when I was working on The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, I started digitizing period type and lettering to make my work more efficient and authentic. And so this is not something that's really part of typical graphic design for film and TV, but it's something that's been beneficial for me. So I'm happy to share more about it. So the funny thing about this career is that it's not just something where grandparents don't understand what you do for work. It's something where almost no one understands what you do for work. It's a really niche job that not many people know exists. So basically, I create anything that is seen on screen with text and or imagery. So this makes us responsible for an almost infinitely broad list of items. So we make many things that you wouldn't really think of as being typical graphic design. And this job, like most film and TV jobs, is basically like freelance work. So when a production starts, an art director will hire me to work in their art department. I'll come in and work for the run of production or however long they need me. And then when we wrap, I'm unemployed until the next production hires me. Most productions have between 1 and 3 graphic designers. So when I was on Maisel, there were also 2 others that were working on the graphics team. So the items that we make in graphics tend to fall into 2 categories: props and set decoration. So props, which is short for properties, are items that the actors interact with. So here we see Midge in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel with a box, and this counts as a prop because she's holding it. And then on the left, we have set decoration, which is all the items in a space around the actors. So all this subway signage that you see is set decoration because it's just parts of the visual world that these actors are moving in. We will also sometimes make things for costumes like embroidered patches or custom fabric, or for hair and makeup like tattoos, obviously temporary. But the majority of our work is in props and set decoration. So when you consider the huge range of items that we create in this role, they fall into 3 kind of sub roles. And the first of which is just as a graphic designer. So these are the kinds of items that you would commonly expect a graphic designer to make in the real world. So this could be anything like posters, menus, vehicle graphics, packaging, publications, all sorts of things like that. So the list on the left is not exhaustive. That's just a short list of examples. And then we stray a little bit further and get into items that would, in the real world, be made by craftspeople. So an embossed photo album would be made by a bookbinder, or signs by a sign painter, or gravestones by engravers. But in film and TV, this all falls into the purview of the graphics team. And if you go back in history far enough, graphic design wasn't even a recognized profession. So before about 1920, the term graphic designer wasn't even in the lexicon. So like if you were working on a show like Bridgerton or Outlander, you would be pretending that you weren't even a graphic designer at all. So everything would fit into either this category or the next, being as a layman. So this is kind of straying the furthest away from items that you would expect. And these would be made by kind of just anyone, your average Joe. And so this is stuff like lost cat posters, financial ledgers, letters. So these things aren't made with the purpose of being design, but they are design. And the really cool thing about that is that it means that if everything is design, then everyone is a designer. And before I transitioned from corporate work to film and TV, I kind of had this like sense of almost divine intervention where I would see design in the real world and think that it wasn't quote unquote correct. Like a takeout menu that looked like it had been made in PowerPoint. And I would think this is wrong. It should be corrected by a professional graphic designer. But this job has really made me realize how kind of imperialist that perspective is and how flat and characterless our world would be if everything was textbook perfect. So from the perspective of a graphic designer for film and TV, a 6-year-old's crayon drawing or a mechanic painting a messy sign for their shop is just as skilled and worthy as a highly refined logo. And it's a really expressive form of design because it says so much about the maker and about its history and like what's specific to them. So it might look easy, but I think of the 3 categories, this is really the hardest one to pull off. Like if you've ever tried to make your handwriting look like someone else's, you know how hard it is to kind of turn your brain off and become someone else. So there are some notable differences in graphic design for film and TV versus for the real world that impact the approach to and the aims of typography. So the first being that perfection or correctness isn't the goal here. I'm reflecting the real world, not an idealized world. And unless the script portrays a world where every single character is a trained graphic designer, there should be whatever the appropriate version of Papyrus or Comic Sans is in that world. And one of the reasons I really love period design is that it captures the human hand and its personality in a way that kind of post-computer design doesn't. Because, you know, like once computers arrived, if one person types their essay in 12-point Times New Roman and prints it out, it looks exactly like another student's essay. And there's nothing that you can really tell about the writer by just looking at their printed essay. Whereas when things are created manually and by hand, there's kind of an amount of identity that gets baked into everything. And it's those are kind of like the imperfections and the quirks that give design a specific maker and a history. And so maintaining that kind of slate wonkiness is really central to pre-computer design. The other thing is that plagiarism really isn't treated the same way it is in other spheres of design. So in graphic design for film and TV, plagiarism isn't really only accepted, it's also kind of integral to it. So this is mainly because we just don't have nearly enough time to make everything from scratch. But the other element to this is that we are depicting worlds that are not our own most of the time, and acting as creators who are not ourselves. So no matter how much research I do, I will never be able to act as infinite different makers. So by taking pieces of what's already been created in that world, I can ensure that my design voice doesn't kind of take over. And also when you're dealing with mid-century design, like of course you want to use what's already been made. It's so beautiful and skillfully crafted. And it's just such a pleasure to really use. And it would feel like such a waste not to when it's all just like gorgeous and sitting there. So as much as clearance will allow me to, I will use real period graphics as much as I can. And when I design, it's really never as myself. So like this is a prop that I made for Maisel. And this should not say Leah Spencer, the graphic designer, made this. It should say Zelda, the overworked and exasperated Polish housekeeper, made this. And I'm also only the makers of others' ideas. There's, of course, tons of small decisions that I have to make along the way to kind of fill in the gaps, but I am only executing what the producer or the production designer or art director, set designer, prop master, what they all envision. So like in this, I might have been the one to decide what Zelda's handwriting would look like, but that was only based on the script and her like character development, what props had requested, the kind of overarching visual identity that our production designer had set. And yeah, it is kind of impossible to not leave any of my own artistic mark, but I do try to separate my identity as much as possible from what I create. And the last thing is that we just don't have most methods of fabrication that would have really been used at the time. Although you will see it in a few cases, like in Wes Anderson films, it's pretty rare to have professional sign painters who can do, actual sign painting on productions. So we do have like scenic artists who do bits of sign painting if the graphics team provides them with a pounce, which is kind of like a template. But even that is really reserved for special uses. And when it comes to printing, the majority of our graphics are printed on either an inkjet or a laser printer in the office. Or if we send it out to a vendor, it's with stuff like direct printing, UV printing, CNC, etc. So even though offset printing and letterpress still is used today, we just don't generally have the time or the budget or the minimum quantities required to use that. Or like Letraset, like you can still source Letraset today, but it's just not fast enough for our timeframes. Generally speaking, there are uses for it, but it's just generally not the ideal way to go about things. And I think it's also kind of worth mentioning how fundamentally computers have changed our mental approach to design. Like when you open Illustrator, you have this toolbar with like rectangle, oval, fill, stroke, gradient, and then you can click a single button and everything aligns really perfectly. And so it tends to kind of make us think in these building blocks, like I can use a rectangle. And instead of approaching it like we would off the computer with kind of a blank canvas, it kind of can lead and like selectively build what we design. So I feel like, at least for me, designing on the computer can kind of limit my originality and can produce design that's a little too precise. So having tools to be able to still use the computer for its efficiency while also maintaining, organicness is really helpful. So this brings us to our solution, which is type revival. So type revival involves taking historic source material of either type or lettering and recreating it as a digital font. So the bulk of my source material comes from places like from lettering books and type specimens, or from online sources like archive.org or Letterform Archive. But I've also gone to places like the Museum of Printing in Massachusetts, the Transit Museum in Brooklyn. There are lots of sources, libraries, historical societies, all good places like that. And I'm definitely not the first person to do this. There are bunches of other type designers out there like Walden Font Co. who also do this, but at a way higher level of refinement than I do. What I do, relatively speaking, is kind of the quick and dirty version, but also kind of everything in film and TV is the quick and dirty version. So it kind of fits. And this is an example of converting text into a vector font. But we can also do it with raster fonts. So in this case, every character in this font is a small raster image. And the benefit of that is that you can preserve really small textural details and gradations in color, whereas a vector font would only give it kind of the illusion of those things. So this is perfect for typewriter fonts, anything with like brush strokes, things that you really want to preserve small texture and color in. So the reasons for and the kinds of type and lettering that I revive fit into three categories. And the first being lettering that was done by hand and was never really a typeface. So when it comes to hand lettering, yeah, there's so much of this beautifully, expertly done professional work. And that's great for many settings. But most movies and shows take place in the real world, whether it's contemporary or period. And so you'll notice that not all of this is exactly the creme de la creme of hand lettering, because natural design that comes from just your everyday human is a really valuable window into character, and that's what we tried to capture in film and TV. And then the second case for type that I revive is type that was a typeface originally, just not digitally. So this mainly covers wood or metal type for letterpress and type from typewriters. So some of these sorts of typefaces might be available digitally, but many are not and can only be found today in ephemera or type samplers. And then the third and last case is type that existed historically as analog fonts that have already been made into digital fonts, but just appear too clean in those digital versions. So most of these typefaces have been digitized because they're timeless and they look great in contemporary design, not because the people who use them want everything they make to look old. So I also want to digitize them, but without all of the refinement that you would see in their typical digital versions. And most of the typefaces that I do with any of these categories are mostly for larger scale applications because, like 10 point new Futura and 10 point like old Futura are pretty indistinguishable, especially from the distance of the camera to then your screen, to then the distance you view your screen at. So that doesn't make much of an impact, but when it's things like headlines or posters or signage, that's where it can make much more of an impact. So this is a page from E.C. Matthews' 1954 publication of Sign Painting Course. And this came from archive.org. And we're going to go through the process of making it into a digital font. So I really dig this sample, but we're going to have to deal with some issues like proportion and some extraneous marks and missing characters. So let's go through kind of an abbreviated process of making a revival font. So the first step that I take is to bring the image into Photoshop and remove any extraneous elements or signs of damage, like tears or dust. And in this case, where the image wasn't particularly high res, I've also enlarged it and applied some sharpening filters. And then I will also adjust the color and the levels so that I have a pure black and white image, so that when I bring it into Illustrator to image trace it, that the image trace has an easier time with it. So if I'm making a raster font, like that typewriter type, the whole process would happen in Photoshop. But for vector fonts, I start in Photoshop and then finish in Illustrator. So now I've brought that Photoshop file into Illustrator, and I will use image trace, usually with the settings of paths increased, noise decreased, and ignore white on. And then I can make the image trace characters a different color and also semi-transparent so that I can see the original through it, and kind of go through each character and make adjustments. But you do have to be careful in how much you adjust it, because refining everything while kind of preserving its original organicness can be a really tricky thing to balance. So I don't usually make too many changes. And as I mentioned before, we have two different proportions in the source image. And this is something that I see pretty frequently in lettering and sign painting books. I guess maybe it just looks nice to have the uppercase letters a little heavier and then the lowercase a little lighter and give it a little visual break. So it does make a little extra work to reduce or increase the thickness to make both sets of letters match in thickness. But then it also gives us the benefit of two weights. So now we have two weights for this typeface. So now that I have all of my characters as vectors, I open up my font creation program that I use, which is Font Self Maker. This is not sponsored, though let me know if you want it to be. But this is just the program that I found through kind of trial and error that fits my process and my goals best. So it's kind of like what WYSIWYG is for web design. FontSelf is kind of the same thing for type design. So it works as a plugin for Illustrator, but also for Photoshop and Procreate. And all you do is you make your vector characters and drag and drop them into the extension window, and then make adjustments to things like word spacing, line spacing, kerning, tracking, all of that, ligatures. Fortunately, I usually want my fonts to have kind of wonky alignment. So there isn't usually too much adjustment I do, but I will make sure that there aren't any letters touching each other or things like that. You'll also see here that I've added in all the numerals and some basic punctuation marks. These characters have all been made with elements of the existing characters. So like the two has parts of the uppercase S and the uppercase L. And I do also like to make what are called contextual alternates for the characters. That's like multiple occurrences of each character, because having two of the exact same letter form is kind of a giveaway of it being a digital font. So if my source has multiple occurrences of a character, then I'll use a few of them to create that slight variation. So when it's all looking good, I export the font and install it, and it is ready for use. So here that font is in use on a shoebox that Midge brings to work in preparation for being fired. The script lettering in Shapiro's came from some lettering that I found spelled out for a different name on a vintage box. And so I didn't go through the full font revival process for it because there just weren't many characters and I didn't have any time. But I will use the process of just tracing things out and copying those letter forms for other bits of graphics. And then the thing with this box is that this was originally a rain boots box that was about twice the size and had like raindrops on it and different text, and that we got like professionally produced by a packaging manufacturer. And then the morning of shooting, it was decided that it should be a smaller kind of shoebox to exaggerate the joke of how few personal things Midge had at the office and that she would have to bring home. So in about an hour, I had to significantly alter the design and the die cut of this, and then make the box myself with whatever we had in the office. So a big part of this job is kind of fire alarm design. And this was definitely one of those. Like, I don't think sweating is part of most graphic design work, but there have been many occasions where I've gotten like aerobic exercise at work. So this is definitely a unique part of this specific job. And then here it is on screen. I had given the prop master a few different colorways for this. And since he knew what color fabric costumes was going to use for Midge, he picked this dark green color so that it would stand out from her clothing. So the thought process for making type revival for hand lettering is kind of straightforward in that it's just letter forms that are different from available digital fonts. And like all you have to do is make those letter forms. But then when you're doing it for printed type that we do have digital fonts for, I think things kind of get a little more complex. So I think one of the important questions to ask when you are creating pure typography is kind of why it looked that way. So people are very good at instinctively knowing if something looks new or old, but it takes a lot more consideration to verbalize why that is. So in this label, we have some Futura bold and demi at the bottom. I haven't actually counted, but it feels like I see Futura more than any other typeface on 50s ephemera. So since it's so widely used, this is kind of a useful revival font to make. And in this case, the primary aim of type revival is to represent the printing process more so than the letter forms. So here I have that original text from the label compared to Futura PT. And it really almost even looks like the new text at the bottom could be from a grocery store today, even though it's essentially the same lettering. So let's identify what's different between the old and the new and why that is. So the original label looks like it was offset printed, which means that a metal plate with the design would pick up this dark blue ink and deposit it onto a rubber surface, and then that would press into the paper. So you can see why this would have a lot of visual similarities to the mark from a rubber stamp, because it's a rubber stamp, essentially. So the first thing is that the outer lines are kind of wavy and blotchy, especially in that smaller line of text. And all of the corners of the letters are also slightly rounded. And in the smaller text, that's actually gone so far as to make what is really 90-degree terminals. It has made them completely rounded. So we also can see that like the corners of the terminals also kind of bulge out a tiny bit. And this is all from that rubber pressing into the ink and into the paper and pushing the ink slightly outwards as it makes the impression on the printing press. And if you look closely at the very outer lines of the original letters, you can see that there's an outermost darker line. And then right inside of that, there's a lighter line. And this is called edge starve. And it's from the ink pulling back up towards the rubber where the paper has come away from it. And there's also kind of this modeling in the inner portions of the letters. And that's also from that pulling away motion. The word spacing is also pretty wide. I don't know if this was just an aesthetic preference or if there's a more functional reason for it, but period typography tends to have really wide word spacing. If anyone out there knows any technical reasons for this, I'd be really interested to hear. But like one of the common things I do on almost every bit of text that I put on period design is increase the word spacing by like 150 or 200%, and it instantly looks older. So that's just something that most period typography has. And I think it's also important to note how exaggerated all of these differences are in the smaller text. If you scaled up that smaller text, it would look way too distressed. And if you scaled down the larger text, its effects wouldn't really be that noticeable. So when I make revival versions of digital typefaces, I will usually make 2 or 3 versions to correspond with the size of the text. And yeah, so there are several great filters and Photoshop actions out there, like from Retro Supply and True Grit Supply, and I do absolutely use them. But they are an extra step that there often isn't really time for. And this doing it, from the original text also tends to give it a little bit more of an organic and a natural look. So when there are so many digital fonts out there, why would you do all this? So the first reason is that it enables me to create design that's really specific and authentic to the time period that I'm representing. And the time period and the geographic location as well, because properly representing a world that you're not a part of is really difficult. And so by using something that actually existed there and at that time makes that much easier. The other thing is that on every film or TV production, there is a legal team that will make a legal agreement with a font foundry or multiple font foundries. And that is all we're allowed to use. So they'll say, for example, you can only use Adobe fonts on this production, or you can only use Monotype. There are special circumstances where we can get an additional font license from somewhere else, but generally speaking, this is it. So especially when you're on something that's period or is highly stylized, this restriction can get even more restrictive. So by making my own fonts, I can give myself more freedom and just make whatever I need. And even though it does take more time on the front end to make these revival fonts, it does make all of the work later quicker for me and cheaper for the production because they don't have to go purchase fonts for really specific uses. And as I said before, it's really rare for productions to hire specialist craftspeople like sign painters, mostly for logistical and budgetary reasons. And so this is kind of the next best thing to that. So I do not intend to or want to replace sign painting or calligraphy or letterpress or any other historic craft. And I don't consider myself to be a sign painter or a calligrapher, but this is kind of the next best thing. And I'm just a graphic designer, bringing graphic design as close as possible to these fields. And especially for props that we may need duplicates of, like a typewritten letter that a character rips up in anger, where we would need probably like 20 plus copies of, having a digital source of that letter really increases our efficiency and decreases variability in all the copies that we make. And because the editors could merge 2 cuts together, those letters all need to be really identical. So that's for props, but it also happens for set decoration, where we will have a set that's been built. We've shot all we think we need to shoot in it, and it's been taken down. And then a month later, it's decided that we need to reshoot that scene. So if that faux painted signage is a digital font, it's also faster and more accurate to have a digital source of it. And the last reason is that I always do this type revival outside of work hours. because I want them to belong solely to me, at least at this relatively early point in my career, where my goal is to become more well-known among art directors and production designers so that I can continue getting cool period jobs. A 9 to 10 hours day in my union rates, plus the future value of those new connections, is worth a lot more to me than selling the fonts. So there have been times that I've been asked to license my font to a production, and my response is always that they can hire me for a day and I will complete the work that they need it for. And also, it's really difficult to control the spread of unlicensed fonts. And so this way, I just completely avoid that and don't have to deal with it. So graphic designers for film and TV are expected to show up with our own kit. So like our own computers, printers, accessories, things like that. And we're compensated for it. So I kind of just view my fonts that I bring onto productions as part of my kit and as an incentive for art departments to hire me. So most of the typefaces I make are made just whenever I have time and for pretty general use. So I just have a constantly growing folder on my computer of type and lettering references that have kind of caught my eye and seem likely to be useful. And then I'll just make them into fonts whenever I feel like it. But sometimes there are also specific use cases that prompt me to create a typeface just for that. So on season 5 of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, the subway sequence that we had in episode 2 was one of those cases. So when I started looking through reference images and tried to match them with available fonts, I just didn't find any that were really a good fit, because New York's early subway signs had a really specific style to them. And it seemed like the only and the best way to accurately reflect that was to take the letter forms directly from their sources. And because we learned about the subway sequence while we were still in pre-production, I had enough time to make my own fonts for it. And I knew that once we did have the script and we were in production, we would be really pressed for time. So having fonts made my process at that latter point really fast. And since I'm working in New York as a period graphics specialist, it seems likely that New York subway fonts would be also useful in the future for me. So because many of these signs only had a few characters on them, it took a lot of combinations of reference images to come up with enough of the alphabet. So I went with the art department on a scout of the Transit Museum in Brooklyn, where I was able to get my own photographs of some signage. But the bulk of my sources had to come from old photographs in their archives and from eBay listings of signs for sale. So I had kind of the challenges of working with lower res images with this, images that were partially obscured or uneven. So these were kind of a tricky bunch of sources to use. So from all of those references, I identified 6 lettering styles to create fonts out of. 5 out of the 6 only have uppercase characters and numbers, since that's almost exclusively what were on these signs. But eventually I do think it would be fun to make lowercase for them too. So as graphic designers, we not only have to design the signs, but we also have to, in most cases, come up with a text to go on them. So in 1960, New York had multiple private subway systems that ran independent of each other. And this made subway signage ridiculously confusing and wordy. And so a big part of designing signage for this was just figuring out what they would say. So I, along with one of our art directors and our art department coordinator, studied period subway maps to pair the scripted action with historically accurate stations and routes. So I can't promise that my signs are reliable for wayfinding, but we really do our best to make sure that the text is as accurate as the design that it's part of. So the exterior subway scene was shot at the entrance to the Transit Museum. And in many cases where we're shooting on location instead of on a built set on a soundstage, we not only have to create signage to tell the story, but also to cover up existing signage. So our construction and scenic crews built these backed green wooden frames that we printed graphics and mounted into. And so this wasn't just to look nice, but also so that we wouldn't have to remove the existing signage to install ours. And then after shooting, it also made removing our signs easy and less likely to damage the museum signage than if we had just stuck adhesive vinyl straight on them. So here those are in the final cut. They're only visible very briefly, but a big part of why we make graphics is to make the space feel immersive for the actors. So it's still worth it to put that amount of effort in. And the really tricky things with the interior signs that we did is that we didn't know until just a few days before shooting which way the trains would move and on what tracks. And arrows are kind of an integral and really beautiful part of New York's historic subway signage. But I had to kind of play it safe and not put any arrows on these so that they could be mounted wherever would actually reflect the train's path on the day of shooting. And also our crew only had an extremely narrow window of time to dress in all of the graphics. So there was really a lot of extra pressure to not have any missing or incorrect graphics. And for these interior scenes, we shot these in 3 different decommissioned stations with different versions of set dressing so that they would appear as 5 stations. And so these images you see here were shot in the same station on the same platform. The staircase that you see at the back separates that one platform into 2 sides. And so one side has red painted columns and the other has blue painted columns. And so we had to make sets of set dressing for every side, for every station. So that resulted in quite a lot of signage. And just like the exterior signs, these signs were designed to fit over contemporary signage in the stations, just without the use of any frames. So because these ones pointed in directions that we wouldn't really see, like where the camera would not go, I was able to add in all the arrows to my little heart's content on these. And these are just a few of the additional set dressing signs that I made. Most of these were also to cover up existing signage, but some of them also covered up contemporary 3-dimensional things like illuminated exit signs or fire extinguishers, alarms, etc. So one of the hardest things about making period productions is that when you go out into the real world to shoot on location, you kind of have to change everything that you see. Like there's not much that can be untouched and look appropriate to the era. And then for the train cars, there was even more signage. Before computerized screens, New York's trains used rotating fabric scrolls in these illuminated boxes to display the routes that train was going on. So we made our version with die-cut black vinyl over milk plexiglass so that the negative spaces would allow that light through. And because there were 12 sign windows in each car, and the train that we used had 5 cars, and then some of those played twice as different cars on other routes, there were over 150 signs just for the cars. So you can see how having fonts for all of this was really a huge time saver, since most of the signage is just pure text over solid color. And this is the shot that I think is probably my record for number of graphics in one shot. The vast majority of the time, the graphics that we make are either never visible at all or barely visible. So it's always exciting to see graphics get a bit of a visual spotlight. And you can see compared to how the station looks today, how much was done by not only the graphics team, but also by set dressing and scenics and costumes and electric and post-production to bring all of this back to 1960. And then later in the season, in episode 9, we had a scene set in an automat. Automats were really cool restaurants that were popular in the early to mid 20th century. And they served hot and cold food and beverages out of vending machines. So every automat was a little bit different, but Art Deco was kind of a common design trend in all of them. And so when I looked through reference images, this became another case where I couldn't really find any ready-made typefaces that were a good fit. And among all of the Art Deco-y kind of lettering styles that I found in my reference images, I picked these 4 to kind of be my base for the type that I made, because they felt like a kind of a good balance between Art Deco and mid-century. And although it's really important to capture the true essence of historical places and times, it's also important to make sure our audience stays in 1960. And we often have to play to kind of a costumey version of design history because that's what tends to communicate best to general audiences. So I noticed that these characters were pretty similar to Pinot. And so instead of having to make every character from scratch, and also because my source images were really small and blurry, I instead just modified Pinot into a new font. So the main changes I made for this were to bring all of those kind of blocky joints to a point and to further thin out the thin lines. I gave the S and the ampersand pretty specific forms that matched my reference images, and I elongated the bottom portions of all of the characters. And I named this new version Pinot Deco, not as any sort of intention for it to be considered part of the Pinot family, but just as a descriptive name that I would be able to remember. So this font went on all of the food category signage. And I cut all of the characters for the category signs out of adhesive vinyl on my Cricut, and then they were applied on set to plexiglass. And as you can see here, a bit of a typographic tragedy occurred, and that is that the ampersand that I was really into mysteriously vanished. And you know that the worst thing that you can do to a graphic designer is take away their ampersand. So we're just not on set that much as graphic designers, especially when we're shooting on location as we were here. So unfortunately, sometimes strange things happen and we don't find out until after it's been shot. And then you can see here all of those category signs, plus all of the individual food signs that I have a close-up of on the next slide, and how we took the reference image and other images like it in the bottom right to create this set. So here's a close-up of those food category, or the individual food labels. This is another case of where making up text to go in the design was a huge portion of the work, because my text had to match the food that was put in there, and the food was purchased by both props for the food that would be touched and by set decoration for the food that would not be touched. So I constantly had to reference these ever-changing shopping lists that both departments had for the food that would go in these machines. And this also didn't necessitate making a whole font. but I did use part of the same process to replicate the letters from this reference image for the windows on our set, which sadly weren't captured on camera at all. But these were made from die cut gold and black vinyl, and then they were applied to the outsides of the windows. This was also another case of just tracing lettering in old photographs to create graphics. Our art department coordinator had collected a bunch of reference photos for the art department to use. And these were just some really tiny details that I found in a couple of photographs. They're, pretty blurry, but I guess it was okay since my graphic is basically as blurry as the original. So it's all fine. So these are just some other typefaces that I've made with this process. As you can see, I've kind of avoided script typefaces so far because they're just a little more difficult and time consuming to make. But I am working on a few of those, and I am also currently working on some more raster fonts for sign painting that have brushstroke textures. So that's kind of what's on the horizon for me. And if you're interested in more kind of nerdy design content, I post my work on Instagram with kind of snippets of my process. So I am at by Leah Spencer on Instagram. And if this career sounds like something you might be interested in pursuing, I did an info session a couple of years ago on it. And so I have the recording from that with the presentation file and a transcript on my website, because this industry has kind of been traditionally walled off to newcomers. I certainly had a heck of a time getting my first job and getting my foot in the door. And so I, like many others, really want to see it become more accessible. So this kind of includes fundamental information that helps people make decisions and take first steps into a career that I think is really amazing and rewarding. So that is all. Thank you. I will stop sharing my screen.
Woo! Thank you so much. That was amazing, Leah. Oh my.
Thank you.
We have a gazillion questions, people.
Oh.
So we will not be able to get to all of them. So please upvote the ones you'd like to see answered. Those are going to go to the top of the list. And let's get rolling. Genevieve asks, how did you get into the graphic design for film and TV? And what advice would you give to a graphic designer that wants to go into graphic design for film and TV?
Yeah, well, there is the info session that I just shared. But the way that I got into it was this was at the very tail end of the COVID shutdown. So my experience might be a little skewed into a strange direction because things were still kind of not at their full speed. But I basically emailed every single person I could find contact information for. And I think I forget how many exactly it was, but it was something like 300 emails over the course of, I think it was like 5-ish months. And it happened that I had emailed the art department coordinator for the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and one of their art PAs decided to leave the job to go pursue something else. And so she gave me a call. So it was kind of like right time, right place kind of thing. I think it's just one of those things where you just have to keep being persistent and bother people a lot until someone gives you a chance. So I, along with most other, I don't know about most, many other people, started as an art PA, production designer, because that is a role that you don't have to be a union member for. And then you can kind of gain experience and then gain entry into the union and become eligible for graphics.
Okay, be persistent. That's what I'm hearing. Thank you. Stephen Coles asks, what are your top, oh, okay. He says skip it, but we'll just say it anyway. Your top sources for finding period graphics.
Okay, this is gonna sound weird, but the collectibles section on eBay is my absolute favorite because first of all, Google has just ruined the word vintage. There's nothing useful you can find by adding the word vintage to a Google search. So when you search things in the collectibles section on eBay, it's actually old. And there's also often pretty high res images of also often multiple sides of the object. Because if something is blank on the back, like I still need to know that. They'll also often include information like dimensions, sometimes dates. And it's also just really nice to have such a variable source because if I Google image search like 1958 brochure and another graphic designer does that, we're probably all going to be pulling from the same sources. So eBay's just kind of nice where it gives you something fresh and gives you really useful information about the objects.
And then of course there's Letterform Archive.
Yes, of course.
besides Letterform Archive, eBay. Okay, sounds good. Let's see. Genevieve's question basically got answered. So Gio Ramos says, as an art department freelancer, graphic designer, how do you keep a living throughout the year or network in this area? I've started in some indie films, but I find it a bit complicated to find something stable in film department. Would love your insight.
Yeah, I mean, especially in a time like now, the actors and the writer strikes have been finished for a while now, but things are still kind of slow. So I think it's important for everyone in this industry to kind of have a fallback or a secondary kind of gig because you have absolutely no job stability in this industry. And like I got hired for a show and then they ran out of money and that was the end of that. So, there's no promises of long-term employment. I was really lucky when I was on Maisel that was a pretty long period of time of the same consistent employment. I mean, it was exhausting, but it was also really pretty fortunate to have that kind of job. So yeah, I guess it just comes down to making sure that you're regularly bothering people that you know and reaching out, at least for the local that I'm a part of, USA 29. There's a list that they make available to members of what's going on. So I check that periodically. So just kind of keeping your ears open and continuing to bother people, I guess, is as far as I know, that's the most you can kind of do.
Sounds like you should join the union too. That might be ticket. Thank you for that labor tip. Patrick Gray says, what is your typical, okay, I think you answered this. What is your typical process for sourcing period correct photography, illustration assets that can be legally licensed?
Yeah, in addition to what I mentioned, at least for stock images, there is a source that I use on productions whenever I can called CSA Archive. And they have the best stock images that I'm aware of for period graphics. They're amazing. But yeah, I mean, I just avoiding the term vintage, I think, and searching for things that are really specific or going to specific sources like historical societies. Lots of libraries have great online archives. And that is also a way that you can get sources that are specific to the region that you're depicting. And also, I mean, whenever you can go in person to places, like if you have historical societies or museums or libraries near you, even if it's not for a job, I think it's always just kind of fun and informative to just continually expose yourself to kind of a mental library of graphic resources.
Librarians know what's up. It's always good to befriend your local librarian, right?
Yes. And historical societies love it when you walk in the door. So they do too.
Okay, let's see. Anonymous asked, what, if any, techniques do you use to age physical props or set decoration?
Yeah, so it depends. In the US at least, we don't really do much aging because of the union structure. That's something that falls under the purview of the scenics. In the UK, things are very different, and graphic designers do a lot more aging over there. But we do certainly still do small bits of aging, depending on the preferences of the scenics. Sometimes I will also add in some digital aging. Um, but that's, I've worked with scenics who don't want any of that because when you print digital age, it doesn't really have the right luster to it and you can kind of pick up on it. So analog is always better, but like I've used, oh gosh, what is it? Potassium something. It's a very vivid purple like powder that you can use to stain graphics. You can also use things like tea and coffee. But there are little bits of staining things and aging things and kind of crumpling them and folding them and kind of putting them through the wear and tear that they would go through naturally, just kind of at an accelerated pace.
Fascinating.
Yeah, potassium permanganate.
Permanganate. Okay,
Yes, that's what it is.
Apologies, I just put potassium something in the answer. So we'll figure
Tongue
that
twister.
out. Yeah. So Katie asks, do you ever ask people for them, like friends or family, to quickly handwrite something for a design so that it looks like it comes from different people?
Yeah. I sometimes I will go around the office and have people scribble out either their real signature or a fake signature. And then I'll keep those as little bits that I can put onto things like, if we're making an office, we probably want some diplomas on the wall. So, I'll add their signatures to the diploma. So that's kind of a nice little legal way to have lots of little signatures that are not in your own hands.
That must be kind of cool too. If you you sign something and then you can see it on this, on TV.
Yeah, I will also ask people for the names of their pets and I'll
Oh,
put those on graphics.
well, I noticed that one musical piece you happened to name the author something Leah Spencer. I was wondering if that was a coincidence.
Yeah, I'm multi-talented.
All right, let's see. People, please keep upvoting these questions because we got so many. Annabelle asks, how was that transition from the corporate world into the film and TV industry?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing was that when I was a corporate graphic designer, I never expected to do anything different. Like I thought that that was just being an adult, having a job that was fine, and then doing the things that you really enjoyed on weekends. And it was just through chance that I found out about this career through a podcast that I was listening to. So I do really love that there is so much more variety in the work that I do now. Like I make something that I've absolutely never made in my life, probably like once a week. So that's really exciting and it's fun to be a lot more hands-on. But you do have to consider that there are some kind of like lifestyle sacrifices that you have to make to work in film and TV. So on most jobs, I work 10-hour days. And with a half-hour lunch break, that's usually 8 to 6:30. And then I also live a little bit further away from the city. So my commute is usually up to an hour. So I recently had a commute that was an hour. So I was leaving the house at 7, and because of the time that my bus would leave, getting back at 8 p.m. So it really can eat up your personal life. And it does make things difficult if you have pets. Some offices are dog friendly, and that's amazing, but some aren't. If you have pets, if you have kids, if you're a caregiver, the job security is definitely diminished. The pay is generally higher in film and TV, so that's nice. But you do just have to be mindful of kind of the personal life sacrifices that you make to do it.
Oh my God, that sounds brutal. Okay, let's see. Dexy asks, At what point in the process do you get to test how your work reads through the lens of the camera? And how does this affect how you approach scale, color, etc.?
Yeah, there aren't too many times where we will get to do a test on camera of graphics. Sometimes we'll do a camera test for other set elements, but it's pretty rare that graphics gets in on time for that, because graphics tends to be the last thing to go into a set. Because, you know, like first they will build the walls and then they'll paint them and put up wallpaper and then put in furniture and then put in lighting, and then we get to graphics. So we're kind of at a little too far in the process to get in for any testing that's done. So usually productions will send out what they call dailies. So you get to see like kind of what's being shot as we're going, and how things are looking, if things are looking too dark or too light. And so, you know, like one of the regular things that we'll do for graphics is that we're very mindful of what's called like movie white, because if you have something that's pure white, it often gets blown out on screen, and especially in period stuff where we want everything a little bit toned down, which is not how it probably would have been in real life. Like in real life, things like in 1960, everyone's paper wasn't aged. But audiences do kind of expect that. So we kind of meet in the middle where like we do age things back a little bit, even if it's not really historically necessary. But then you do also have to make considerations for how things will read from the distance to the camera. I think kind of in the same way that you would think about how a billboard would be read by drivers far away, we kind of think about things in the same way and prioritize kind of higher level design elements that communicate really efficiently rather than the small things that tie us up and take longer. So yeah, I guess that's my answer.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's kind of funny. Our expectation that some paper in the 60s will be all yellowed, even at the moment, you know. Come on. Okay. The strangest prop you had to design, asked Kate. Good.
It was
question.
phallic. I
Wait,
guess that's
what?
all I'll say. So I haven't had to do this yet, but I have worked with people who have had to make very X-rated things, like DVD covers. So I haven't had to go that far, but I have made some questionably shaped stickers that were you always have to, it's kind of an occupational hazard to have certain things on your screen when you're at work and you're like, no, like it's really it's work, I promise. I guess that's it. Yeah.
I like that, questionably shaped stickers. Oh my God. What are your favorite typography or lettering books? Asks Anonymous.
Actually, where is it? Okay, this is my favorite. This just happened to be behind me. This is a sample book from an office supplies and stationery printer. And it is a beautiful work of art that has like actual like printing, and there's, I don't know where it is. But like, I mean, just like the actual thing. So yeah, they have some like real things tucked in here. I think there's a part where they even have some like metallic printing. And so this is like this is such a perfect way of having the real thing. We have like I don't know what this is. I think it's a like a little advertising blip. We have someone's repair form that they've stapled in here. It's just like, oops, something fell out. We have Haynes greenhouses. This is it's letter pressed, so it has some like texture in it. It's just like it's an amazing, some business cards. It's just an amazing collection of real ephemera printed by this printer. And because, let's see, I forget what year it is exactly. I don't know what year it is. Somewhere in here, I'm sure it says. But this is just like it's a really nice way of specifically knowing what year something came from and having it tactily in your hands and like seeing the texture and size and every side of it. So it's yeah, I love this book. It's amazing.
Very cool. That is, where did you get that?
Sometimes things mysteriously disappear when productions wrap.
Okay, no questions asked. Um, let's see. Charlotte asks, do you need to gain permission or rights to use the original source lettering?
Generally, no. So in the US, our copyright laws are kind of funky in that the letter forms of fonts are not protected by copyrights. It's only the software that is. So despite that, just to be safe, I generally stick to public domain sources. But I mean, there's not technically really any protection against letter forms. So I definitely avoid contemporary makers of design. Like I really try to make sure that at least they're no longer living and need to make a living off of their work. But public domain is kind of your safest bet, even if, you know, technically they're kind of fair game.
Awesome. Charlotte asks, for illustrated props, do you usually illustrate them yourself or source existing illustration?
It depends. There were a few cases on Maisel in season 5 that I actually had the time to do it, where I illustrated from scratch some things. Like there was a Christmas tree farm map that I did. In that case, I had just drawn the black parts with like calligraphy type pens, like a dip pen. And then I added the coloring, like kind of fake watercolor in Photoshop. Then there was another map. I guess I just like maps and I am willing to sacrifice the time because maps are just so much fun. I made a map for the industrial that we had in the episode 4, I think, of season 5 of Maisel, and that I also did by hand and then colored digitally. So when we have the time, I love to do illustration. But when we don't have the time, that's where stock images come into play. And also anything that was made, I think it's before 1924 at this point. I have to check that, but I think it's 1924 is all public domain. So unfortunately, sometimes that looks a little too old for mid-century. But if it's going to be background or if it's going to be really blurry, it kind of still works. So that's another way that you can get illustration.
Okay. Okay. Keep upvoting those questions, people. Natalie asks, can you, okay, I think you talked about that. Daniel Nisbet asks, do you ever spend time actually working with older methods of design, printing, etc., from past decades to better familiarize yourself with the process, creative mindset, or design details of a time period?
Yeah, I've taken classes in letterpress and screen printing, things like that, just for kind of the fun of it. It's never been something that I've been able to do while I was on a job because it's kind of just like go, go, go. And the pace that we work at in film and TV is just so much faster than the pace for kind of like real world design. But yeah, I think it's really useful. Like the same goes for aging things. Like even though that's not really a part of what we do, at least in the US, I still think it's really valuable to experiment with it and become familiar so that you know that even if you're not doing that part of it, like there have been times that we've sent things out to bookbinders or letterpress or screen printing, even if I'm not the one actually doing that process, it's still really informative to know how I can tailor my design to work best with those processes. So I do think it's really valuable to still kind of experiment with those things and learn more, so that whatever part of it that you do actually do, that it kind of gels with those real processes. Or if you're just completely doing like faux whatever it is, that you're mindful to the really subtle details that you wouldn't think of until you actually do it with your own hands.
Totally true. What happens? Ooh, Alyssa asks, what happens to all of the props after the production has wrapped? Do you get to keep anything? Are things reused or recycled?
Yeah, I think yes to all of those. So on Maisel, when we wrapped, that was 6 years worth of production. So you can imagine that there was a lot, probably more so than most productions, because that's kind of an unusually long time for a production to go, especially in these days when everything is streaming and new things and limited series. So there, at least for Maisel, there was a sale at the end where the crew and the cast and some local people were able to come in and purchase things. There were some things that I kept, like this calendar was in the why am I blanking on the name? The garment factory, whatever. Okay, whatever the name was, I'm blanking on it. So like there's some things that I've made and kept. Usually they're more likely to let us take it home if we actually make it. But then a lot of things will get sold to prop houses or costumes to costume houses, or other productions will come take them. So I think we gave away, we had like some sort of subway set from an earlier season when we made it on the soundstage, and that went to another production. There is unfortunately a lot that honestly just ends up in dumpsters, which is kind of heartbreaking on multiple fronts. But yeah, so I guess most things do find happy homes, but there is a sad amount that is just kind of very temporary in this world.
I see Ryan Budgeon in the chat asks, where are the dumpsters?
Oh, those are long gone. I wish, yeah, I wish.
Oh my God. Okay. Let's see here. Kevin Umama asks, what is your most well-known prop?
I don't know. I don't know what people actually have seen. I mean, I kind of assume that like 99.9% of the things I make will never be noticed at all. I think that's more likely for things to be like kind of subconsciously noticed and to kind of build towards a greater sense of the setting. So I guess it's kind of just whatever gets the most prominent screen time. So like that subway signage was kind of visually featured quite a bit. I guess on season 5, I also had a little bit of screen time with that binder that Zelda made. And that was a really, really fun prop to make, because I wound up with an unusually long amount of time to make it. And so I kind of just went crazy and made a lot by hand that was never seen, but that I knew was in there and the actors knew. So that was really fun. And which Rachel Brosnahan shared it on Instagram after that. So I think that helped it be in front of more eyes. So that was a really fun one. But yeah, I don't know that anything I've ever made has been widely viewed.
Did you get to keep that binder?
No, I don't know where it went. I was really disappointed in myself for not hunting it down when we wrapped. That was kind of a bummer.
Ooh, hopefully it didn't hit the dumpster. That would be
I won't think about that.
Let's see. Christine Uren asks, and I apologize if I butchered anybody's name. Okay, I'm sorry. Asks how do you print on specialty papers such as newsprint? Since these are such small run jobs, it seems hard to get custom papers and find print shops to use them.
Yeah, so sometimes we will print on newsprint in the office. It is terrible to print on newsprint. I have genuinely questioned many of my life choices while trying to print newspapers. They just constantly get crushed and crumbled and stuck in printers. but I mean, it's possible. It just takes a lot of suffering to do it. But there are vendors that are commonly used in film and TV. So like in New York, the main two are DeBoer and Quantum Visual Imaging. And so they're really attuned to the typical needs and turnaround times and materials for film and TV. And then there are also some smaller kind of like specialty sources and vendors that we'll use for printing kind of like medium run newspapers, magazines, engraving, things like that. So they're among film and TV, we kind of know who to go to that kind of caters to what we need.
Right. You're really getting workout here from all these questions. Let's see. Dougie asks, are you seeing generative AI being used in the production of props?
I haven't seen it used in the production of props yet. And I don't know where it will go in terms of graphics in general. I've heard discussion about it, especially with the developments that Photoshop has had in generative images. I will say that the one singular use of AI that I love and I'm so appreciative of is using Chat GPT to write body text for graphics that will never be legible. It is just a pure waste of time. I don't want to say pure waste of, it feels like a pure waste of time to write out enough text to fill like a newspaper, because like we can put lorem ipsum on things, but on the off chance that the camera does actually catch the writing, we don't want that. Also, it's kind of distracting for the actors. And so it's kind of a nice tool to just get text onto page that no one's ever going to read. It's kind of just there to function as image almost. Like generally speaking, most text in graphics kind of just functions as image because it's very rarely actually legible. So just making up text, I think, is kind of a nice use of it. But yeah, I don't know where it'll go outside of that.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense, to create something that, what if the camera just caught a little glimpse of it and there it was, lorem ipsum, dolor sit on mat. Oh, okay. Berika says, in the shows you have worked on, which would you say was the most challenging and what did you learn from it?
The most challenging one was it was a futuristic show that I did. And it was called Extrapolations, and it was challenging just because it was futuristic. I don't know if I will ever do futurism again. It was so hard because like when you do period, there's so much that you can lean on, and it's like I don't need to be the expert at anything, and that is so comforting that like the experts are already there. They've already made it all. All I have to do is create pastiches of their work. Whereas with futurism or also anything that's fantasy, you're working with a world that does not exist. And it's also with futurism, you're also trying to predict what's going to exist, which is like kind of impossible. And to be the one to say, this is what graphic design looks like, and also do that without kind of making it look like silly futurism, that is just really hard. So I have a lot of respect and appreciation for everyone out there who does beautiful futuristic work. It's really hard.
Okay, gang, we have time for one last question, and then you're going to just have to contact Leah on Instagram or wherever else to get the rest of your questions answered. We have a question from Josh Corwin who says, rabbit holes. Do you find any tension between getting the job done on a tight deadline versus falling into the seemingly endless amount of historical material to reference? Did you ever stay up until the wee hours researching, asking for a friend?
Yeah, this is a really hard trap to not fall into for me. And I think really commonly among other graphic designers for film and TV, that the point at which we have to say good enough, time to move on, just comes so much faster and sooner than in most graphic design, because our time is just so limited. And like where you might have a few months to make a new logo for something in the real world, we have like 2 hours. So it really abbreviates the creative process and forces you to be really kind of instinctual with your design decisions and know when to kind of call it quits. So there are certainly many things that I have made that have left my desk that I wish never see the light of day. And so like obviously like the things that I post on Instagram or I add to my portfolio, like that is a very narrow window of the things that I have made. But yeah, it's really hard to let things go, knowing that it's not perfect. But I think you kind of have to keep the perspective that most of what we do builds a set or a scene by being one really tiny part of a greater world, and that perfection is not necessary for that. So as long as we've kind of hit the highest level of design elements that communicate what we need to communicate, then it's time to move on.
All right. Thank you so much, Leah. This was magnificent.
Thank
You,
you.
everybody, for joining us today and for sticking with us through this grueling Q&A. Have a great afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.